Berlin, the end of April 1945. Completely destroyed by bombing raids, the city is in its death throes. Russian tanks roam the center, firing at anything that moves. During the last days of the war, the battle for Berlin rages like a crazed animal. Before it's all over, another 10,000 will die. These sensational pictures were never shown in the West. And why? Quite simply because they are not authentic. This footage was shot in a Moscow studio, which spared no expense to film this reenactment of the battle for Berlin. The most dramatic scenes are from the Soviet propaganda film The Fall of Berlin, which the Russians produced in 1949 to tell the story of the Great War of the Fatherland as they saw it. These pictures of house-to-house fighting may appear to be genuine, but they're faked. That becomes apparent when the camera suddenly zooms in on the supposed action in the Reichschancellery, the power center of Nazi Germany, whose days, even hours, are numbered. The Führer is shown as a grotesque madman, punch-drunk and loud, refusing to accept reality.
Meinen Sie, dass der Krieg schon zu Ende ist? Sie sind kurzsichtig, Chris. Aber nein, nie ist für uns die Lage so außergewöhnlich, militärisch günstig gewesen, wie augenblicklich.
If Hitler and his henchmen had really been such cardboard figures as the fall of Berlin makes out, the powerful myth of the Führer would never have existed. Yet it did. And Hitler spent the final hours of his life making cold-blooded decisions that cost the lives of tens of thousands. For decades, this footage depicting the battle for Berlin has been regarded as accurate. It's presented as authentic in many documentaries. Today, however, more than 60 years after the end of the war, we know better. It would have been a suicide mission to film in the midst of such an inferno. And the result would have been nothing but a tangle of blurred takes. So Russian film teams decided to shoot these scenes in the form of a reenactment during the first week of May. When these deafening guns, known as Stalin's organ pipes, were fired in the film, just a few houses got knocked down. But the images convinced the world. You really have to look closely to realize that there's something fishy about these scenes. In this scene, the valiant Soviet army continues the battle, while right next to the action we see a group of liberated Berliners calmly pumping water. This dog doesn't appear to be at all troubled by the fighting. White flags. On the 30th of April, Hitler took his life in the bunker of the Reichschancellery. 2 days later, it was all over. Was there ever really a 0 hour? Even 60 years later, these images are still being repressed. Too much was destroyed back then, within the individuals themselves and in the world around them. Survival was all that mattered at the time, to crawl out of the ruins. The war was over, at least in Berlin. At the headquarters of the victorious Soviet army, General Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel put his signature to this document. Herewith, we, the undersigned, unconditionally present to the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces and the High Command of the Red Army all armed forces on land, on the seas, and in the air that are at present under German command. The summer of 1945, taking stock from the air. Berlin, the German capital, was destroyed, along with more than 160 other German cities, their historic centers annihilated. The capital's main boulevard unter den Linden, the Friedrichstadt, Museum Island and the Royal Palace had been almost completely destroyed. The Berlin Schloss, residence of the rulers of Prussia for more than 700 years, lay in ruins. Allied bombers in hundreds of night raids wiped out countless cultural treasures, not only in the capital, but all over Germany. The country was shattered. About every 10th German had died in the war. 1/3 of the national assets had been wiped out. The war destroyed half of all homes and schools, 40% of all transportation facilities, and 20% of all industrial buildings. Did people in Germany really feel that this 8th of May 1945 was the day they were liberated? Well, certainly it freed everyone from the inhuman yoke of Nazi tyranny. And yet, in the years that followed, hundreds of thousands of refugees who had lost their homeland and all their possessions and had to start from scratch in an alien environment would owe no debt of gratitude to their liberators. On the contrary, they would perceive the inglorious end of the lost war as the real cause of their suffering, for flight, expulsion, imprisonment, and the loss of freedom. Millions of German soldiers were interned in prisoner of war camps. No doubt at the beginning of the hostilities, many of them followed Hitler blindly. They were committed to undoing what they saw as the one-sided Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. So long as Germany was winning, they believed the words of the Führer. He spoke of defending the honor of the fatherland and all sorts of other noble aims. Just as soldiers in all wars trust their governments, that the goals for which they are risking their lives ultimately serve a good and just purpose. For young soldiers in particular, lads of 16 and 17, who had grown up with the ideology of the Führer, a whole world fell apart when Germany was defeated. During the last few months of the conflict, they had been conscripted into the so-called Volkssturm and called upon to defend the homeland. For the veterans, those soldiers who had been in the war from the very beginning and who had foreseen the eventual disaster, those months and years on the front remained a lifelong trauma, which they never wanted to discuss in later years. As the injustice of the regime they had served became more and more clear, they and millions of other Germans were only glad that it was all over, that they had survived the nightmare of the Second World War. But how could it have happened? How could the German people get caught up in this strange madness that turned millions of individuals into a nation of sleepwalkers? As if in a trance, they swore allegiance to a man and his ideology which, under the symbol of the swastika, attacked half of Europe in the strange belief that there would be no resistance. With their own country transformed into a landscape of ruins and their proud flags abandoned on the ground, it all seemed to have been so long ago that these banners waved all over the country, and all those who carried them aloft had been proud to be part of the German nation, the newly awakened country that had dedicated itself to virtue, courage, and bold enterprise. And didn't millions of them love this self-appointed Führer? Had they not revered and adored him as if he had been the Messiah? To determine how the Third Reich and the Second World War came about, we have to go back as far as the year 1914. It was the First World War that laid the groundwork for all that happened later. Early August 1914, the army mobilized. Amidst a turbulent crowd at Odeonsplatz in Munich, we can recognize a young man whose face reveals his enthusiasm at the news that war has broken out. The Austrian, Adolf Hitler, volunteered for war service. He said he wanted to be allowed to appear in the divine service of the eternal judge as a witness to the testimony of the truth of my greater German convictions. The conflict was sparked by the assassination in the Serbian capital Sarajevo of the successor to the Austrian throne, Franz Ferdinand. Germany could easily have kept out of the matter. It could have urged its ally, Austria, to restrict itself to diplomatic moves. It was evident, though, that the emperor and the military establishment in Germany did not want to keep out of the impending conflict. After all, the country had been expanding its military potential for years. It had been more than 100 years since the Germans had lost a battle. People were certain that the military authorities knew what they were doing. A grave error that would eventually transform the map of Europe. None of them could possibly foresee that millions of people would perish in this totally senseless war, or that it would destroy everything they thought they were fighting for: honor, duty, loyalty, and the fatherland. The German war plan, dated 1905 and drawn up by General von Schlieffen, called for the defeat of the French in a blitzkrieg before France's ally Russia could come to its aid by attacking Germany's eastern border. The Germans had a clear idea of how this campaign was supposed to run, exactly like the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71. The war would be over in a couple of weeks, and the joyous German troops would return home. A few soldiers would of course die for the fatherland, but all the others would become national heroes. And in fact, the initial weeks of the war seemed to confirm the optimistic predictions. German troops invaded Belgium, occupied most of the country, and continued marching through northern France until just outside Paris. Then, however, their advance was suddenly halted. Soon it became clear that this war would not end in a few weeks. On September the 10th, the German offensive ground to a halt. A 4-year-long face-off began. The mobile blitzkrieg turned into static trench warfare. Months later, in the spring of 1915, war weariness set in on both sides. The troops risking their lives had no sense that their governments were pursuing a strategy. The early battles on the Marne degenerated into senseless destruction of men and material. The front lines barely changed, as the modern technology was continuously stymied by old military strategies. And another important factor was apparently ignored with fatal consequences. Germany had neither sufficient natural resources for war production, nor was it in a position to import the urgently needed raw materials. In February 1916, the German High Command attempted to force a final outcome. Since the autumn of 1915, the United States had been helping the Germans' enemies with huge shipments of desperately needed war materials. As a result, the Germans justifiably feared the other side would gain a permanent military advantage. So they decided to launch a massive attack on the French fortifications at Verdun. The aim was to make the French concentrate all their troops there. However, the spring of 1916 was unusually cool and changeable. As soon as rain fell, the battlefields were transformed into totally muddy terrain. It was impossible to advance. The desolate reality of this landscape mocked any kind of military strategy. Combat in this environment was tantamount to an absurd apocalypse. The Battle of Verdun was one of the most lethal in the First World War. When the fighting stopped after 10 months, the Germans had suffered 335,000 killed or wounded, and the French 350,000. The heavy fighting at Verdun had weakened the French army to such an extent that in early summer their British ally decided to begin a major offensive on the River Somme, with the aim of weakening the already exhausted Germans, whose resources of material and manpower were depleted. After months of bitter fighting and heavy losses on both sides, the British and French troops managed to push the Germans back a few kilometers. But the casualties were so high that the Battle of the Somme had to be abandoned towards the end of November 1916. In view of the increasing war weariness on all sides, in December 1916 the German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg made a proposal to end the war with a so-called compromise truce that would have cemented the stalemate situation. No victors, no losers. The Allies, however, turned down the German offer. They were only interested in a truce that would give them the victory. On the home front, since early 1916, there had not been any fresh meat in the shops. All food was rationed. The government had already put price limits on fats, bread, butter and milk in an attempt to prevent prices for these foodstuffs in short supply from climbing even higher. The bread ration was cut in the summer. The rainy year of 1916 had already caused crop failures, and instead of potatoes, people were urged to eat turnips. German civilians suffered a famine since all foreign imports had stopped. Added to this, a Siberian cold front swept across the country. In February, temperatures sank to as low as -16 degrees Celsius. There was no clothing to buy in the shops, and new shoes were only available in exchange for others. Because of the extreme cold, schools were closed until the end of March. Supplies of coal were stopped as rivers froze. This generation of children learnt at an early age the meaning of deprivation, hunger, and misery.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Johnny, show the Hun, you're a son of a gun. Hoist the flag and let her fly.
In 1917, the United States entered the war. The Allies gained a gigantic flood of war material and armaments, as well as foodstuffs and coal. Much more quickly than the German High Command had foreseen, US troops were deployed in France. To transport the troops across the Atlantic, the US authorities confiscated German passenger ships. They were packed to capacity, and the men slept in shifts. By the end of March 1918, 329,000 US troops had landed in Brittany. Russian clergy blessed the troops. On the Eastern Front, this war claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands. Since the Battle of Verdun had put France's back to the wall, it asked its Russian ally to relieve the pressure by stepping up its offensive. In answer to this request for help in the middle of March, troops attacked German positions at Lake Naroch. The direct result of this directive, which was thought up by armchair strategists, was the loss of about 100,000 Russians, dead and wounded, with absolutely no apparent gain in territory. In the summer of 1916, the Russian army, under the command of General Alexei Brusilov, launched a massive offensive, and although it initially achieved great success against the Central Powers, it soon became bogged down and was stopped. As a result of the so-called Brusilov offensive, more than 1 million Russian troops were either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. These enormous losses caused unrest among the Russian troops. In the spring, the catastrophic economic situation in the Russian hinterland, as well as the collapse of the supplies of foodstuffs for the civilian population, eventually led to hunger strikes, revolts, and protest demonstrations. On the 23rd of February, the near-famine emergency led to large-scale riots in St. Petersburg. Workers and soldiers joined hands to march through the city. The Tsar was forced to abdicate. At first, the parliament, the Duma, and the worker and soldier councils, the Soviets, existed side by side. Together, they decided to issue an amnesty for all political offences and proclaim freedom of the press and assembly. A provisional government was appointed, but it could do nothing to counter the violence in the streets. It looked on helplessly. In the same year, following the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia. They declared that they would no longer continue the war which, as they put it, had been started by an officers' clique at the Tsarist court. In March 1918, the new Russian government signed the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The war on the Eastern Front was over, at the cost to Russia of 25% of its European territory. For the Germans, it was a Pyrrhic victory, for the unclear political situation forced them to station large forces in the east. March 1918. With a massive spring offensive, the German army's general headquarters decided to stake everything on one card. They knew this was the last chance to defeat the British and the French, so as to achieve a compromise truce. The odds were 50-50, as the British and French forces were also extremely exhausted. Shortly thereafter, though, the situation changed. From the end of March, the Allies suddenly gained numerical superiority with the arrival of American troops. For the first time, the front line had to be moved back. The newspapers in Germany reported the large numbers of German wounded and prisoners of war. The United States intervened in the war because it feared the loss of the loans it had made to Britain. The Allies were encouraged by the certainty that they would soon be reinforced by fresh reserves of manpower and material. The Germans suddenly met with unexpectedly stiff resistance. The American troops suffered from a lack of combat experience and had to undergo a program of basic training in Brittany first. However, the very fact of their presence had a demoralizing effect on the German army. A much more significant psychological effect was achieved by the tanks they brought with them. These monsters were entirely unsuited to the terrain of Flanders, which was completely churned up by grenades, and the Germans had no way of knowing that they had no more than a few hundred anyway. In the fourth year of the war, Germany's shortages of manpower and material had a disastrous effect. The men were shocked to learn that the German High Command was considering capitulating without having lost the war, and while all their troops were still on enemy soil. The American President Woodrow Wilson declared in his 14-point resolution, America would no longer continue in the war if there was an immediate armistice. One of America's conditions was the immediate abdication of the Kaiser. Towards the end of September, Ludendorff lost his cool, and with Hindenburg's approval, requested that the Chancellor Max von Baden signalize to the Americans that Germany would agree to a compromise truce. Taking stock of the war was a horrendous task. More than 8.5 million men had been killed, and more than 21 million had been wounded. There were nearly 7.5 million prisoners of war and troops missing in action. Were these millions of dead and the eternal misery of war all in vain? Although people were glad that the war was over and that they personally had managed to survive, the prevailing feeling was one of skepticism. After all, the country was absolutely shattered. Overnight, the Hohenzollern monarchy had been forced to abdicate. In this period of upheaval for which no one was prepared, Germany stood on the brink of civil war. The Russian Tsar had been murdered by the Bolsheviks, and a small band of revolutionaries was using violent means to turn the country into a communist workers' and farmers' state. Many people feared that a similar situation could happen in Germany. Following the Social Democrat, Philipp Scheidemann, that same afternoon the communist Karl Liebknecht also proclaimed a republic. In January 1919, the Social Democrat Friedrich Ebert managed to get elected president. The danger of anarchy appeared to have been avoided. In other cities in the new republic, however, a battle was raging between those who wanted to lead the revolution into the calmer waters of a bourgeois parliamentarian system and those who were determined to introduce communism into Germany. In the spring of 1919, the victorious Allies paraded through Paris, thus pouring salt into the wounds of many of those in Germany who had already felt humiliated by losing the war. With the end of the conflict, Germany had suddenly lost all of its foreign investments. When the war began, all of its patents had been confiscated. Through these measures, which barely get mentioned in the history books, billions of dollars were transferred to the accounts of the European allies and the United States. Assets which the reparations demands of Versailles, however, disregarded and were not credited to Germany's account. After the end of the war, the US demanded that Britain and France pay back their loans. This naturally had a decisive effect on the amount of reparations, since the First World War put Britain and France too deeply in debt. At the so-called peace talks at Versailles, the Allies deliberated for weeks among themselves, and this did not bode well. June the 28th, 1919. The 5th anniversary of the assassination of the heir to the Austrian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which triggered the First World War, was the date set for the German delegation to sign the peace treaty dictated to them by the victorious Allied powers. In addition to the loss of all its colonies, Germany had to agree to give up Alsace-Lorraine, Memel, and West Prussia, as well as the Upper Silesian industrial basin, a territorial loss of 70,000 square kilometers. In addition, France temporarily occupied the Rhineland, and the Saarland was temporarily ceded. Germany also had to abolish universal military conscription and had to limit its army to 100,000 men. Because the blame for the war had been placed on Germany, the country had to pay an as yet unannounced amount in reparations. 1 year later, this amount was specified: 261 billion marks. In several German cities, passionate rallies took place, and all over the country there were mass protest demonstrations, like this one in Berlin's Lustgarten. However, the freshly elected German government was preoccupied with attempting to establish a modicum of domestic order. Shocked by the sudden demise of the Hohenzollern monarchy and deeply affected by the attempts at revolution, the Germans were focused on their own situation, the struggle for survival. The population of the Rhineland protested against the occupation. However, this had no effect, as the central government didn't support their protest. Time and again in these unruly times there were attempts at a coup d'etat, endangering the new republic. In March 1920, leading members of various Free Corps units, nationalistic military-oriented groups, and the Reichswehr, the new German army, tried to topple the regime. The government fled to Dresden, where it called for a general strike. 5 days later, the putsch fell apart because of the lack of popular support. There was no loss of life. The army was able to restore law and order. The first half of the 1920s was anything but golden. It was marked by hunger, poverty, and deprivation. Yet the worst was still to come. Towards the beginning of 1923, the so-called Reparations Commission announced that Germany was in arrears with its coal deliveries. France felt justified in making good on its threat to occupy the Ruhr basin. The struggle for the Ruhr saddled Germany with enormous burdens. The printing presses continuously printed new money to cover the rising costs of government. The result? Massive inflation. Prices rose much faster than wages and salaries. In mid-June, a pound of butter cost 15,000 marks, a pound of coffee between 25 and 35,000 marks, and an egg was priced at 800 marks. It was in these weeks and months that, for most Germans, the savings of a lifetime disappeared. Even millionaires saw their fortunes destroyed by the inflationary spiral. On the 15th of November, the nightmare was over. Currency reform, the so-called Rentenmark, was introduced. 1,000 billion old paper marks were equal to 1 gold mark or Rentenmark. Millions of people didn't know how they would continue to feed their families. There were no welfare offices, only naked desperation. The overwhelming majority of Germans were united in their condemnation of the peace treaty, the Versailles Treaty, which the Allies had forced on Germany. With its grotesque demands for reparations, it was to blame for the hopeless situation which prevailed. That widespread conviction caused people to seek salvation in small radical political parties, like the German Workers' Party, in which a certain Adolf Hitler, in no time at all, managed to gain a reputation as a charismatic orator. At first, there'd only been small groups of listeners, but by early 1923, tens of thousands were fascinated by his speeches. Hitler employed emotional gestures and a whining tone to describe how he would break the fetters of the Versailles Treaty. As strange as it may seem, it was Comrade Lenin who was Hitler's model. What impressed Hitler most was Lenin's concept of the totalitarian one-party political system. In a fit of megalomania mixed with amateurism and a large portion of naivety, Hitler decided in November 1923 to stage a putsch with the party's armed wing, the SA. With a few loyal comrades, he marched towards the city centre. At the Feldherrnhalle in Munich, the police dispersed the protest demonstration. Hitler was jailed. His march to the Feldherrnhalle resulted in 16 dead and many injured. While confined in the fortress at Landsberg, Hitler wrote his confessional Mein Kampf. Hardly anyone ever read it, and even later during the Third Reich, when it was given to every newly married couple, it was said to have been the least read bestseller. In 1925, the German president Friedrich Ebert died unexpectedly. The funeral procession passed through the Brandenburg Gate. A symbol of German democracy took leave of the political stage. His successor was the 77-year-old General Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. It was an emotionally colored election. Hindenburg was considered to be of upright and incorruptible character and was a man of the Reichswehr. However, he had no political experience, and the country would soon pay dearly for this shortcoming. Towards the middle of the 1920s, the economy boomed. Following the currency reform, money regained popular confidence. The good mood was further affected by the so-called Dawes Plan, according to which from 1924 the terms of Germany's reparation payments were to be extended. Another factor that strengthened the German economy was a loan from the United States, totaling 800 million gold marks. This served to boost the economy of the Weimar Republic and stabilize the general economic situation in Europe. The US wanted to maintain this enormously important consumer market so as to strengthen the American economy after the war. An economically weak Germany would have been to no one's advantage. A key word for the restructuring of German industry was rationalization. Entire branches of industry were remodeled according to this principle and examined for their degree of efficiency. The period of economic growth which followed benefited not only businessmen, tradesmen and shopkeepers, but also blue-collar and white-collar workers and civil servants. By 1928, the standard of industrial production and wages once again reached the pre-war level, with a considerably shortened working week. Heavy industry too, mining, iron and steel production, as well as mechanical engineering and the textile industry, stepped up production. Investment in new plants and factories doubled. From 1924, scientists, researchers and industrialists traveled to the United States to study the new American technologies, in particular in the Henry Ford Works. Their aim was to adapt these new production systems to the German economy and make it once again internationally significant. During the 1920s, many ambitious housing projects took shape, marked largely by a new departure in architecture, the clean lines of functionality. Berlin, the city with the most publishing houses, newspapers, magazines, theatres and cafes, exerted a magnetic attraction. Directors, writers, actors and artists gathered here, creating a cultural scene which in Europe of the 1920s was second only to Paris. The post-war years were a time of experimentation and avant-garde trends, and the innovative spirit often served a political purpose. Novels like Alfred Döblin's Berlin Alexanderplatz depicted realistically the daily life and the poverty of the ordinary people. As a member of the frontline generation, Erich Maria Remarque described the horrors of the First World War in All Quiet on the Western Front. In 1919, Kurt Tucholsky attacked militarism and nationalism in Germany, Germany above all, a cynical sideswipe at the right-wing political opposition. Most city dwellers were not very interested in coming to grips intellectually with the social misery of the past few years. They sought amusement. The new artistic medium, the cinema, provided mass entertainment. In 1927, the most famous silent film of all times was given its premiere. Fritz Lang's mega-production Metropolis, a gigantic science fiction adventure. Metropolis is a utopian city in which the exploiting class resides in luxuriously furnished skyscrapers and the exploited live in underground workers' cities. The machine-like woman Hell and the robot-like armies of workers in the slave quarters were symbols of the increasing mechanization of the workaday world of the Weimar Republic. The metaphors permeating the film presage the disaster that is just over the horizon. The reasonable position of the political parties leads in the film to a tremendous catastrophe. The theatre, too, dealt with the life of the workers. Following its premiere in Berlin, Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill's threepenny opera was an international success. Socially critical entertainment in modern dress. The new topics also corresponded to new production forms. The peep show stage was dead, displaced by revolutionary stage sets and projections. Left-wing theatre in the Weimar Republic was a trademark of Erwin Piscator. These post-war years were an age of radicalization and experimentation with avant-garde styles. Politics and culture were closely interwoven, and the spirit of artistic innovation was often placed at the disposal of a political party. The National Conservatives, as well as the Nazis, hated the parliamentary democracy of the Weimar Republic, labeling it an un-German political system forced upon the country by the victorious Allied powers. They fought against modern art, calling it Americanism, or they discredited it as cultural Bolshevism. In 1928, the Nazis even went so far as to set up a militant league for German culture, which demanded a return to national cultural traditions in classical and folk music, as well as in nationalist-oriented art. Meanwhile, in the cities, revues and dance halls shot up like mushrooms. The Charleston, the highly popular American dance craze, took Germany by storm. And it was Josephine Baker who almost single-handedly ensured its popularity. The 25th of October 1929. The New York stock market ended the day with a sudden fall in prices of record proportions. Many shares fell by as much as $50. The slump continued from day to day, until Wall Street was shaken to its roots by Black Friday, the 29th of October. Total losses on the stock market during that last week in October were $50 billion, and they were not restricted to the US. Economically unstable as its economy still was, Germany was also directly affected, because it had been trying to stabilize its economy with the help of American loans. The consequences for Germany were bankruptcies, unemployment and layoffs. all results of the loss of markets for the country's all-important export sector. By 1932, the economic crisis in Germany was at its height. The politicians were unable to react to this new challenge. Instead, partisan conflicts intensified as Parliament, government and the President competed with each other in seeking solutions to the pressing problems of the day. Towards the end of the Weimar Republic, there were 6 million unemployed. Every third person had no income. Guaranteed social welfare payments and unemployment compensation, which we take for granted today, were unknown back then. Many people were forced to live at the subsistence level. That meant starving and freezing. Soup kitchens managed to give the needy at least one warm meal a day. People queued for hours just for a can of milk. Most Germans had thought such scenes were a thing of the past, the lost war, the 1923 inflation, which they had put behind them. But people were suffering once again. And the miserable conditions affected not only the poor, but also those who had been prosperous and had suddenly lost their entire fortune as a result of the worldwide depression. Once again, families with many children were forced to live in Nissen huts, poorly heated corrugated iron barracks, which, as was the case only a few years previously, again dotted the slums in the country's major cities. This dangerous concoction, which the average person didn't understand, caused many Germans to open their ears to the siren calls of the country's charismatic politicians, loudly chanting their recipes for getting Germany out of the mess it was in. The consequence? A dizzying succession of unstable government coalitions with shaky parliamentary majorities and the resultant new elections. It wasn't just the Nazis who won more and more votes. The communists also gained in strength. They planned to remedy the situation with wages and bread. Confidence in democracy and the Republic faded rapidly. Many thought the Republic, as a form of government, was responsible for the disastrous economic situation. More and more people called for a strong hand to run the affairs of state and to restore Germany to its former grandeur and international standing. It was at this point that Hitler's attacks on democracy fell on fertile ground. The Nazis were represented in Berlin by Dr. Joseph Goebbels. In his function as Gauleiter, he was responsible for recruiting members for the new party. The Nazis continued to gain ground with the electorate. The election campaigns were controlled by the SA stormtroops with their street battles. The stormtroops were originally set up at the beginning of the 1920s to protect the speakers at Nazi party rallies, and they were not exactly gentle in their methods. Conservative elements, radical academics and the so-called educated bourgeoisie, also came to see in Hitler an alternative to what was generally termed the danger from the left. There was one question on which all political parties in the Weimar Republic were united: the centrist parties, Social Democrats, Communists and Nazis. The condemnation of the Versailles Treaty and the call for revising it. However, since 1930, the bourgeois right-wing parties had lost votes at each successive election. There was no way they could be an effective force in opposition to Hitler. For the communists and their allies, who were more interested in world revolution and class struggle, Hitler's vehement outbursts regarding blood and soil and the nation and territory were insufferable. What did this man have that caused the crowds to be spellbound by him?
Wir sind intolerant. Ich habe mir ein Ziel gestellt, nämlich die 30 Parteien aus Deutschland hinauszufegen. Sie verwechseln mich immer mit einem bürgerlichen oder einem marxistischen Politiker, der heute SPD ist und morgen USPD und übermorgen KPD und dann Syndikalist, oder heute Demokrat und morgen Deutsche Volkspartei und dann wieder Wirtschaftspartei. Sie verwechseln uns mit ihresgleichen selbst. Wir haben ein Ziel uns gewählt und verfechten es fanatisch, rücksichtslos bis ins Grab hinein.
Hitler attacked everything that could in any way be connected with democracy, from the party system to the democratic principle itself. And the Nazi Party became a sanctuary for all those opposed to the democratic system, for all those who had been disappointed by democracy, for the bitter and fanatical elements, apart from those, of course, who were attracted to the communists. The democratic centre saw the re-election of the old president Paul von Hindenburg as the only way to prevent Hitler from becoming German Chancellor. But how could this old man, who had never been sympathetic towards the Democrats, integrate all elements within Germany under the common denominator of opposition to Hitler? It was an election campaign under complicated and at times contradictory conditions. The Nazis were by far the largest group in parliament. Pointing to his huge success at the polls, Hitler refused the offer of participating in a coalition government. Instead, he demanded that von Hindenburg give the Nazis, in full, the responsibility for leading the government and the state. But the president categorically refused to accept Hitler as Chancellor. The Führer, however, had a trump card, a group of influential patrons who for years had been supporting the Nazis with financial donations. Among them was the powerful media tycoon Alfred Hugenberg. Following a series of exploratory talks and backroom deals, Hitler finally got his way. He was appointed Chancellor of Germany. In years to come, this day, the 30th of January 1933, would be remembered as the day he seized power, as if a coup d'etat had taken place. But that was not the case. The Nazis became the strongest party as the result of a democratic election. Little did the Germans realize that this day, the 30th of January 1933, would alter the course of world history. Hitler's stormtroops marched through the streets of Berlin in a kilometre-long torchlight procession which passed through the Brandenburg Gate. In future, they would be marching even more frequently. The torches were like an eerie beacon illuminating the road Germany would be taking in the years ahead. It was evident that the conservatives and even President Hindenburg had underestimated Hitler's and his Nazi party's thirst for power. Hitler was not one to spend much time in discussion, nor would he make compromises with his cabinet. He is said to have described parliaments as gossip parlours, and in future matters would be arranged according to the will of one person, the Führer. He had sometimes softened his tone to reassure skeptics, but from February 1933 onwards, he abandoned those tactics.
Deutschland ist nun erwacht. Die Macht haben wir nun in Deutschland gewonnen. Nun gilt es, das deutsche Volk zu gewinnen. Ich weiß es, meine Kameraden, es ist euch wohl oft schwer gefallen, wenn ihr meintet, es müsse nun ein Wandel kommen und er kann nicht und immer wieder muss erneut Appell gerichtet werden. Es muss weitergekämpft werden, es geht nicht, ihr dürft nicht handeln, ihr müsst gehorchen, ihr müsst euch fügen, ihr müsst euch diesem unerhörten Zwang beugen.
The rise of the Third Reich did not happen by chance. It wasn't just the result of one man's charisma, it was carefully planned. On the 27th of February 1933, exactly 4 weeks after Hitler had been appointed German Chancellor, the parliament building, the Reichstag, was set on fire. The Nazis declared immediately that this was a conspiracy by the German Communist Party. Single-mindedly, the leadership exploited the fact that the fire happened shortly before the parliamentary election on the 5th of March 1933, to intensify its persecution of all enemies of the new regime, in particular the communists. Within the next 7 days, thousands of opposition members were taken into so-called protective custody and shipped off to improvised concentration camps. Only 3 weeks later, the German parliament, which had moved across the street to the Kroll Opera House, passed the so-called Enabling Act, which transferred all authority to initiate laws from parliament to the government. The two-thirds majority vote to pass the law was easily achieved, as only the Social Democrats rejected the bill, which was subtitled Law to Relieve the Disastrous Situation in the Nation and the State. Only 94 Social Democrat deputies were present, and following a moving speech by their leader, Otto Wels, they all voted no. The remaining 26 Social Democrat deputies were absent, having either been arrested or gone into exile. The Enabling Act of the 23rd of March 1933 permitted the German government to govern without parliament for a period of 4 years. It was the legal basis for Hitler's dictatorship. The democracy of the Weimar Republic was buried for good. Indeed, as early as the summer of 1933, Hitler could proudly boast that everything beyond the reach of the Nazi Party had now been destroyed, dissolved, dispersed, disbanded, or absorbed. In only a few weeks, he had assumed control over all the country's police forces. Germany had become a dictatorship. In May 1933, the next step in Hitler's infamous plan ought to have been a wake-up call for the rest of the world. In front of the State Opera House on Berlin's main boulevard Unter den Linden, the books were burning. After having destroyed democracy, the Nazis were now exterminating the nation's intellectual and artistic spirit. With the toleration of the authorities, and aided and abetted by the police and fire brigade, Nazi students, stormtroops, the SS and their cohorts gathered at the State Opera House in Berlin and in many other German university towns to burn books which they labelled un-German. Books by authors on the Nazis' blacklist were consigned to the flames. Works by Karl Marx, Heinrich Heine, Sigmund Freud, Erich Maria Remarque, Heinrich Mann, Erich Kästner, Kurt Tucholsky, Bertolt Brecht, Leon Feuchtwanger, and many others. The book burning may not have been officially organized by the Nazis, but it suited Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels very well.
Der kommende deutsche Mensch wird nicht nur ein Mensch des Buches, sondern auch ein Mensch des Charakters sein. Und deshalb tu dir gut daran, diese mitternächtige Stunde den Ungeist der Vergangenheit den Flammen anzuvertrauen. Das ist eine starke, große und symbolische Handlung. Eine Handlung, die vor aller Welt dokumentieren soll. Hier sinkt die geistige Grundlage der Novemberrepublik zu Boden. Aber aus diesen Trümmern wird sich siegreich erheben der Phönix eines neuen Geistes.
The Nazis had only been in power for a few months, and the country had changed beyond recognition. Hitler's rhetoric was often rather unconvincing. It was mostly banal and repetitive. But his presentation had tremendous energy and a rhythm as insistent as a drum beat. It was this style, combined with infectious mass emotions and the energy of thousands of people gathered in a confined space, which gave rise to a kind of mass hysteria, a kind of religious fervour. He transported his audience into a state of consciousness usually associated with mystical experiences.
Ich kann mich nicht entfernen von der Liebe zu diesem einen Volk und hege felsenfest die Überzeugung, dass eben doch dann einmal die Stunde kommt, in der die Millionen, die uns heute verfluchen, hinter uns stehen und mit uns begrüßen werden dann das gemeinsam geschaffene, müde erkämpfte, bitter erworbene neue deutsche Reich der Größe und der Ehre und der Kraft und der Herrlichkeit und der Gerechtigkeit. Amen.
Hitler viewed himself as a herald of divine wisdom, as a political preacher intent on converting millions of unbelievers to the true faith, of which only he was in possession. The Nazis used psychological tricks to awaken within Germans deeply embedded impulses and to manipulate them.
Gott sei mit uns.
Hitler's goal was the creation of a national community that could be instrumentalized, and the Nazis attempted to attain this goal by infusing their worldly ideology with the same kind of liturgical elements that religions use. They displayed their faith at huge popular events, reminiscent of church processions and religious services. The Nazi system was not aimed at the intellect, but at hearts, at nervous systems, and at the unconscious minds of the people. To accomplish their purpose, they turned to the oldest techniques of religion: elaborate ceremonies, group singing, rhythmic repetition, invocation like rhetoric, color, and light. The film evidence depicts people who worshipped the Führer as a deity. When President Hindenburg died in 1934, Hitler took over his duties. There was no longer a constitution that could have kept so much power from being wielded by one person. Hitler now held the three top posts in the Third Reich: Chancellor, Führer of the Nazi Party, and President. The Führer of the Germans turned his visions into a reality.
Soll ein Riesenwerk zeigen von unserem Willen, unserem Fleiß, unserer Fähigkeit und unserer Entschlusskraft. Deutsche Arbeiter, an das Werk!
His Autobahn was intended to be the highway to full employment, a broad, intersection-free motorway to general prosperity. A veritable army of formerly unemployed labourers threw back their shoulders, grabbed their shovels and joined in the scheme, to throw yet more dust in the people's eyes. This job creation scheme, though, dated back to the days of the Weimar Republic. But Hitler adapted the scheme to his own purposes, like the idea of building a car everyone could afford. The Volkswagen and the Autobahn were two of the regime's early blessings with which people felt they could go along for the ride. For many city dwellers, this was their first trip to the farming areas, and almost voluntarily they helped with the harvest. Country life became popular again, and urban decadence disappeared under traditional melodies. Modernity was no longer popular, tradition was in. Women in Germany discarded the pageboy hairstyle in favour of braids and pigtails. Blood and soil were the catchwords for this new era. Nowadays they have a somewhat unpleasant sound to them. Pleasantness, though, German Gemütlichkeit, is ultimately a matter of mood. And the new political elite knew how to provide the prevailing German mood with lots of folksiness. In September 1935, Hitler had the so-called Nuremberg Laws proclaimed, the law to protect German blood and German honour, called for short the Law to Protect the Blood. The so-called law governing German citizenship was also proclaimed. This law stipulated that only people of German blood or of related ancestry could claim German citizenship. Arbitrary laws like these and many others sent a clear message to Germany's Jews in particular. Law and order in many aspects of life in Germany had been suspended. Hundreds of thousands of farmers celebrated the annual festival of Thanksgiving on Bückeberg Hill near Hamelin. Delegations from all Germany's provinces, or Gauen as they were now called, waited for hours for a chance to see the Führer. How can we explain the meteoric and apparently unstoppable rise of a political agitator who for the first 35 years of his life had been a political and social nobody? What led millions of people in Germany and elsewhere to share the visions of this man, to adopt the absurd slogans of his propaganda minister, and cheerfully obey the orders of his regime? What enabled Hitler to rely almost to the very end on a loyal following? How was he able to count on the consent of the overwhelming majority of the German people? How could he employ his mass movement to gain dictatorial control of a highly developed and modern industrial country with a great cultural tradition? How was it possible for the overwhelming majority in Germany to make its peace with this unlawful regime? How could it happen in this society, with its tradition of the rule of law, that such criminal and paranoid elementary energies were released, which finally led to a war that engulfed first Europe and then the whole world, and produced one of the greatest collapses of civilized society in modern times? We can only find serious answers to these questions by trying to understand the issues which moved people back then, by asking what was important to them. Berlin in the spring of 1936. All those visitors from abroad who could manage to ignore the omnipresent sea of flags saw Berlin as a fairly normal large city, full of activity. But it was no longer the pulsing metropolis it had been in the Golden Twenties, when its exciting cultural scene exerted a magnetic attraction on artists and intellectuals. Everything now seems more orderly, neater, and better behaved. As clubs and other social organizations were mostly banned, many social niches and independent milieus disappeared. For many Germans, though, especially those who were not persecuted and marginalized either politically or racially, the 1930s were alive with a feeling of new horizons in the offing. Many Germans viewed the changes that had taken place in the past few years positively. Instead of class struggle slogans, the new ideal of the national community was propagated. It appealed to the little man, both white and blue-collar workers. For the Nazis, it was in particular young people and how to educate them that was of prime importance. Even before they assumed power, the Nazis had set up the Hitler Youth as their organization for young people. All over the city, one could see young people in uniform. As early as 1932, about 100,000 boys and girls were organized in the Hitler Youth. National Socialism is young people's organized resolve, was a popular slogan of the time. The Hitler Youth aimed to do away with social differences. That at least was the official line. Nazi convictions were promoted by staging propaganda marches and parades. At first, young people could decide for themselves whether to participate or not. But by the end of 1936, they no longer had a choice. Membership became compulsory. But the overwhelming majority of youngsters did not have to be forced into participating. Those who chose not to take part felt socially excluded. Alongside family and school, the Hitler Youth soon became the most important social institution for young people. With field games, camping, and sporting events, the Nazis didn't only want to capture the interest of the young. These group experiences and sporting competitions were also intended to prepare adolescents for life in the army. A slogan of the time was, "One for all for one." Introverts, individualists, and outsiders had no place in the Hitler Youth. Once a year, a select group of 50,000 was given the privilege of traveling to Nuremberg to march at the Nazi Party rally. The annual Nazi Party rally, a mass event of gigantic dimensions, lasted one full week. More than 1 million people made their annual pilgrimage to Germany's most German town to be present when the Führer spoke. The newspaper Nürnberger Landeszeitung wrote on the 16th of September 1935, "We sit spellbound in the huge oval that encloses the spirit and the strength of the emissaries of Germany's youth. 36 blocks are partitioned into 6 gigantic divisions on the green lawn of the interior. They face the main platform that is occupied by the leadership of both the party and the state. Their gleaming eyes reflect their ideals. They are Hitler's youth, the youth of our state.
Ich schwöre bei Gott diesen heiligen Eid."
To make completely sure that none of these young men would ever have doubts about one day wearing a military uniform, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, had them swear a holy oath by God to the Führer.
Ich will als Parteigenosse
im Dienste der Gemeinschaft des deutschen Volkes. Gewissenhaft und opferbereit meine Pflicht erfüllen. Für die Größe und Ehre der deutschen Nation.
14 to 18-year-olds were brainwashed in the Hitler youth camps, so that only a few years later, when war broke out, they would possess all the ideal characteristics of a soldier: discipline, obedience, and the conviction of fighting for a good cause. They would carry out all orders. They would never doubt the sense or purpose of what they were ordered to do. After all, they had sworn an oath of unconditional obedience. The whole iniquity of the system was contained in this oath, which committed an entire generation to blind obedience. Hitler was a master of manipulating the masses. One of the books which greatly influenced him in his younger years was by the French physician and sociologist Gustave Le Bon, Mass Psychology. There he read, "Since crowds can only be moved by excessive feelings, strong effects must be employed: shouting, protesting, repetition."
Jungen und Mädel der Hitlerjugend im Landdienst.
The Nazis combined the process of brainwashing with practical work. Their volunteer youth labor scheme became compulsory.
Die deutsche Jugend hat durch ihre selbstverständliche Hilfsbereitschaft einen engen Kontakt zur bäuerlichen Bevölkerung hergestellt.
Many young people worked on farms. The Nazis' intention was to instill in young people ideological values such as a sense of duty and strong willpower, as well as camaraderie, group allegiance, and physical fitness. While the boys working on the farms acquired physical fitness and discipline, the girls organized in the Hitler Youth's League of German Maidens were trained to be useful helpers.
Auf Hof und Feld sind sie dem Landvolk unentbehrliche Helfer geworden.
The aim of the League of German Maidens was to educate girls in the ethnic sense of duty and the Nazi spirit of sacrifice. The principles of the Hitler Youth, discipline, good breeding, obedience, and subordinating oneself within hierarchic structures, applied to girls as well as boys.
Anmut, Grazie und Rhythmus vereinen sich zu einem Bild freudiger Lebensbejahung.
The boys were supposed to turn out as tough fighters, the girls as demure German mothers. The most important lesson this generation of women learnt was reliability, a sense of duty, and the spirit of sacrifice are what the Führer expects of you. These are characteristics that would soon be desperately needed. In August 1936, the 11th Summer Olympics were held in Berlin. In front of a crowd of 100,000 in the newly built Olympic Stadium, Hitler officially opened the Games. That event, too, was transformed by the Nazis into a perfect propaganda spectacle. They hoped to gain prestige both at home and abroad by staging the Games. As early as the summer of 1933, the government had complied with a request of the IOC by issuing a declaration that the Olympic Games would be open to all races and religions. And the Nazis appeared to keep their word. Anti-Semitic slogans disappeared from the city's streets, and for the duration of the Games, anti-Jewish agitation disappeared from the media. The star of the Olympics was the Afro-American athlete Jesse Owens. Not only did he win the 100-meter dash, he took 3 additional gold medals and became Germany's darling. A dark-skinned American, so Hitler refused to shake his hand. But the crowds loved him. How could that be? Didn't Nazi doctrine view dark-skinned persons as members of an inferior race? And didn't most Germans by that time share Hitler's notion that the descendants of the old Germanic tribes were the master race, superior to other peoples? Culture and everyday life in Germany during the 1930s certainly bore little similarity to what Nazi propaganda in the media was trying to make people believe. The permanent exhibitions on Museum Island with their ancient treasures and the works of the old masters attracted thousands of visitors. The metropolis Berlin, with its many lakes, the Landwehr Canal, the steamers plying the rivers Havel and Spree, the city's many leisure activities, culture, sports and entertainment, and Berlin's excellent public transport provided people with a great variety of recreational opportunities. And they made use of them, even if they only wanted to be alone, away from politics, where one could talk about all the things that are important to people in their daily lives. Relationships, family, health, problems at work, the latest fashions, the most recent scandals. What's that I hear? German women don't smoke or wear makeup? Certainly not in public. Well, think again. The zoo was a favourite place to meet if you wanted to converse in private, without the danger of eavesdroppers. Nazis rarely visited the zoo. In his standard work, The Split Personality, the sociologist Hans-Dieter Schäfer concludes that the reality of life among the Germans in the years just preceding the outbreak of war was much less regimented than the official propaganda used to imply. Although the Nazis did their best to organize people's leisure time, they evidently met with limited success, since quite often people just wanted to splash about in the water or enjoy a quiet time with friends and family in private. On the other hand, you can't miss the Nazi flags here too, at the lakeside beach in Wannsee, and a session of organized gymnastics has attracted a small crowd of fitness fanatics. But the party realized if it didn't allow individuals at least a few opportunities to be off by themselves, they would do so surreptitiously, in private nooks and crannies, hidden away from prying eyes. To prevent people from occasionally planning their own activities, the Nazis set up their leisure time organization Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy, as early as 1933. Of the 7 million holiday trips during this pre-war period that were taken on ships of the Kraft durch Freude movement, 690,000 sailed to destinations such as Norway, Madeira, and Italy. Of course, there were always some Nazi spies on board whose job was to keep their fellow passengers under observation. All efforts to emancipate the Jews of Germany came to a sudden end when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor. When the Nazis assumed power, they first used a subtle balance of terror and propaganda in their efforts to eliminate the political opposition. However, as early as the spring of 1933, the first wave of government-organized terror against Jews emerged. A boycott of Jewish shops, department stores, physicians and lawyers. During this campaign, on the 1st of April 1933, Germany's Jews were confronted by an ugly tide of hate that had been fomented for years by the Nazis. Most of the 525,000 Jews in Germany, although shocked by these outbursts, thought the anti-Semitic riots and consequent attacks on life and property were no more than yet another symptom of the centuries-old persecution of Jews. The general feeling was that this was a natural outcome of the national period of euphoria following the victory of the Nazis, and that it would soon blow over. This tendency to underestimate the rise of anti-Semitism would soon prove to be a fatal mistake. The defamation, intimidation, and exclusion of German Jews from almost all aspects of social, political, and economic life soon became routine, and most of their non-Jewish compatriots looked on in silence. At first, the Nazis chose to rely on voluntary emigration as the solution to what they called the Jewish question. The Nazis' massive program of excluding Jews from public life and persecuting them reached a new climax with the racially inspired Nuremberg laws of 1935. These made Jews second-class citizens with whom non-Jews were not allowed to associate. But despite persecution, repression, and the all-pervading anti-Jewish propaganda, most Jews chose to stay put in Germany, because they still felt German and they couldn't speak any other language. Besides, to travel to the United States, for instance, they required a visa. The end of September 1937. On the third day of his visit to Germany, the Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini arrived in Berlin. With mass rallies and military parades, the Führer and Mussolini marked the Treaty of Friendship between their two countries. In honor of the Duce, the entire city was decorated with swastika banners and flags of the Italian fascists. Hitler got the army to stage a parade intended to convince Mussolini that, in spite of all that had been on Germany's mind during the past few years, the importance of making the country a first-class armed power had not been forgotten. The official climax of Mussolini's visit was the mass rally on the evening of the following day. 2,500 banners had been hoisted. Everything was planned precisely. The color of the uniforms and the flags, the placing of the spectators, the late hour, the deployment of floodlights using 78 light cones to create the effect of cathedrals of light. At the Mayfield, adjacent to the Olympic Stadium, and in the stadium itself, 650,000 people gathered to listen to the speeches of the two leaders.
Das faschistische Italien ist durch die geniale schöpferische Tätigkeit eines gestaltenden Mannes zu einem neuen Imperium geworden. Sie, Benito Mussolini, werden in diesen Tagen mit eigenen Augen aber die Tatsache am nationalsozialistischen Staat festgestellt haben. Auch Deutschland ist in seiner volklichen Haltung und seiner militärischen Stärke wieder eine Weltmacht. Wichtig ist, dass unsere beiden großen Völker ihren Menschen die gewaltige und wachsende Masse von 115 Millionen betragen, zusammenstehen in einer einzigen unerschütterlichen Entschlossenheit.
The rally ended, as always, with a gigantic fireworks display. This nighttime firestorm triggered a whole range of contrasting emotions among the thousands of onlookers who experienced it. Whereas some of them were deeply moved by the way the almost unreal torchlight procession formed a swastika, others saw in the slowly revolving play of lights an uncanny symbol. In less than 2 years, the flames they had just seen would flare up into a world conflagration. The Nazis were in a hurry to get Germany's cultural life under their control. In the summer of 1937, the Grand German Art Exhibition in Munich's new Haus der Deutschen Kunst provided a clue to official Nazi policy on the fine arts. Hitler was at the height of his prestige, both at home and abroad. He opened the exhibition with pomp and ceremony. On display were exclusively works of Aryan art, many of which the Führer had personally selected. It was important for the Nazis to exhibit what they deemed to be the best in German art. They presented 900 works by living German artists and sculptors, what they called the wholesome art of the German nation. These are works that reflect and glorify the Nazis' official doctrine of blood and soil. What the public saw was a glorification of Germany. Kitsch and the official conservative ideal of beauty were intended to place the new, racially pure German man and woman on a pedestal as the greatest expression of German art. The very next day, the Nazis opened another exhibition in Munich, intended to be in negative contrast to their concept of German art. Entitled Degenerate Art, the touring show presented about 600 works by 110 artists arranged chaotically. The list of artists represented there reads in retrospect like a roll of honor for modern art in Germany. Marc Chagall, Raoul Hausmann, Wassily Kandinsky, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Paul Klee, Emil Nolde, Oskar Schlemmer and others. Modern art was anathema to the Nazis. The party determined what was art and what was not art. The Nazis had no time for art theory or for the autonomy of art. Artists had to serve the needs of their state, their nation, and their race. Athletic bodies served the Nazis as propaganda for their aesthetic of the Nordic individual, who for them symbolized beauty, purity, and elegance. The sculptures and monumental works by the two most prominent Nazi sculptors, Arno Breker and Josef Thorak, were intended to demonstrate with heroic pathos the superiority of Aryans. Members of the SS were viewed as the embodiment of the Nazi master race ideology and as guardians of the purity of the blood. The SS, the black-shirted so-called security squadron, was founded by Heinrich Himmler, one of Hitler's earliest followers. From 1929 onwards, he single-mindedly developed the SS into an elite organization to serve the Nazis.
Wir müssen einen neuen Menschen machen, auf dass unser Volk nicht an den typischen Degenerationserscheinungen dieser neuen Zeit zugrunde geht. In unseren Augen, da muss der deutsche Junge der Zukunft schlank und rank sein, flink wie Windhunde, zäh wie Leder und hart wie Kruppstahl.
The Hitler myth and the cult attached to him did not develop spontaneously. They were constantly being reinforced. State and party propaganda placed Hitler and his claim to absolute power in the center of public attention. This in turn created the breeding ground for revering him as a kind of deity, or as a pop star when he appeared to his followers. Hardly anyone who participated in these mass rallies was able to resist the powers of seduction that emanated from such communal experiences. What followed in March 1938 was a masterstroke that had been carefully prepared by Hitler, the union of Austria with Germany. On the 12th of March 1938, German troops marched into Austria on Hitler's orders and were greeted by wildly cheering crowds. To prevent the Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg calling a plebiscite to cement his country's independence, his Interior Minister, Seyss-Inquart, a dedicated Nazi, sent a telegram to Hitler, requesting him to send in German troops as soon as possible. 4 weeks later, Hitler had the reunification of his homeland with Germany, which had been so close to his heart, certified, so to speak, in the form of a plebiscite. Official results put the yes vote at 99.73%. He addressed a wildly enthusiastic crowd of hundreds of thousands at Heldenplatz in Vienna. As the press reported, they had gathered to welcome their native son back home.
Als Führer und Kanzler der deutschen Nation und des Reichs melde ich vor der deutschen Geschichte nunmehr den Eintritt meiner Heimat in das Deutsche Reich.
Hitler soon formed a Nazi-dominated government in Austria and implemented the union with Germany. Berlin in the summer of 1938. Within a few weeks, and without much previous notice, the victory column was suddenly moved from its place in front of the Reichstag to the Great Star intersection, where it was raised by several meters. Hitler's chief architect, Albert Speer, needed the extra room in front of the Reichstag to carry out his secret gigantic plans for redesigning Berlin. His name for the project, Germania, the capital of the Reich. Hitler told Speer to begin with the reconstruction of Berlin. To turn the city into a true metropolis, huge excavation work in the so-called Spray Bend area was planned without consulting Berlin residents. Speer's designs were monumental. In the summer of 1938, in the vicinity of St. Matthew's Church at Kemperplatz, entire blocks of flats were demolished to make room for new structures that would eventually flank the future Great Circle, in the midst of which water would gush from a gigantic fountain. This was to form the nucleus of a new north-south axis that would begin with a new trunk railway station in the north near the North Harbour and would end at a second trunk railway station 7 kilometres further south. To get an idea of the gigantic size of these new structures, you only need to look at the tiny figures on the architectural models. The intimidating facades would reduce these individuals to no more than meaningless ciphers. The focal point of this project was the so-called north-south axis, in the centre of which was the Great Hall. With a height of 300 metres and room for 180,000 people, it was to have been the largest building in the world. These grandiose ideas were the brainchild of Hitler himself. At his holiday home, the Berghof near Berchtesgaden, he would often be found working away on his architectural plans. To put these ideas into practice, he turned to the young, ambitious architect Albert Speer. In no time at all, Speer was promoted to the posts of General Construction Director and later to Armaments Minister. He provided Hitler with just what he wanted, architecture that had basically one goal: to intimidate people with overbearing structures, whose huge size exploded the bounds of conventional dimensions. At the beginning of 1938, Speer was commissioned to build a new Reichschancellery in the middle of Berlin, in the ridiculously short time of 12 months. The interior of the building was officially described in these words: "By using precious materials, a serious atmosphere of color will be created, combined with subtle strength, reflecting the habits of the Führer at work." The intention was to impress foreign visitors. Hitler received his guests in this corner of his 400 square meter large study, at the head of which stood a huge desk. The truth is that Hitler rarely sat at his desk. He developed his global ideas in his holiday retreat in the Alps, the Berghof on the Obersalzberg. It seems that it was only here that he could find the time to flesh out his visions of a new world order and the prominent role that Germania was to play in it. There's no doubt that Hitler was deeply convinced of his mission, to change the world according to his ideas, by the strength of his own willpower. He saw himself as a crusader, a swastika-bearing knight whose duty it was to convince the world of his idea of a new master race that had yet to be bred. Even he must have been aware that contemporary Germans and other representatives of the blue-eyed, blonde-haired Nordic nation didn't exactly correspond to his ideal of a noble race. That was evident at the opening of the House of German Art in Munich, when a huge procession marched through the Ludwigstrasse. An anachronistic crew of historically costumed individuals, at their head, figures from classical Greek mythology. According to the Nazis, that was the historical source of all things Germanic. Important representatives of Germanic culture and history were depicted in the procession, from Charlemagne and King Henry the Lion to Friedrich Barbarossa. Gigantic floats rolled by with their depictions of various significant scenes from German history. A team of aurochs trotted onto the scene, pulling the float of Demeter, the fertility goddess. Or is that a young warrior enthroned high up on the float? It couldn't have been easy for the public back then to comprehend this pageant. No easier than it is for us to understand this interpretation of German culture. The Nazis favored a highly individual view of history. They produced a kind of patchwork of facts and legends. If you look closely, you can guess what the swastika-bearing crusaders with their open visors are really up to. On that evening in July, those who stood watching the colourful but somewhat incoherent historical procession roll by could not foresee that dark storm clouds were already slowly but inevitably gathering on the political horizon.